Conservative commentator Ben Shapiro gave an interview in 2013 that exposes a religious bias in his reasoning. This bias persists throughout Ben's discourse, stunts his intellect, and limits his ability to use critical thinking and empathy while discussing topics concerning social policy and social change. In part of that 2013 interview, while talking about religion, free will, determinism, and his personal belief in God, Ben claims that responsibility is built into us and inherent or given to us by God. Ben also claims that the best proof of religion is that a person gets to make decisions about how to live their life. These two claims ultimately combine to create Ben's bias. Let's take a look.
Responsibility because it's built in. We understand that inherently human beings are responsible for their own actions. The best proof of religion to me is the idea that I get to make a decision about how I'm going to lead my life.
This is the weird box that Ben's religion has built him into. I know it's a lot to look at all at once, so start with God on the top left and follow the arrows. In Ben's eyes, we have God building in responsibility, which means that responsibility is, in Ben's words, inherently possessed by humans. Those humans are free to live life by making decisions, which, according to Ben, is also the best proof that God exists. Putting aside the fact that this box of reciprocity sees God give humans the power to prove God's existence, what's important to understand is that this way of thinking is why we always hear Ben talking about personal responsibility, personal agency, and good decision making. Because this is the lens through which Ben sees human existence. We are all individuals who God has built responsibility into, therefore it is up to the individual to make good decisions. Ben's religious viewpoint is probably sufficient for self-governing at the individual level, but when we're talking about large-scale social change, Ben is still looking through the religious filter of individual decision-making, which is too close-minded to include the critical thinking and empathy necessary to understand that social change must also factor in that people all have different experiences, environments, influences, and ways of living. Ben's religious model, or bias, absolutely sucks at recognizing this because it makes Ben channel everything that happens almost exclusively through the individual. In a 2020 episode of the Joe Rogan podcast, Rogan and Ben get into a discussion about systemic racism, where Rogan tries to get Ben to see how the effects of slavery, Jim Crow, and redlining still have an impact in the present day. Ben's response is that the laws are now the same for everybody, so now people just have to make good decisions. This highlights the religious bias that I was talking about earlier, where Ben's intellect maxes out because he can't get into any thinking that goes deeper than personal responsibility. His religious bias won't allow him. So he says this.
The problems that have plagued communities in the United States, not just the black community in the United States, but problems of racism or problems of sexism, the way those get alleviated is people making better choices over time. The way to fight against that is to make good decisions. The answer is there's only one way to break that chain.
What way is that?
That way is to not pick up a gun and shoot somebody.
I think that's a simplistic way of looking at it if you're on the outside of that community and you're not one of those 18-year-old kids that grows up with the incredible influence of all the people around him, and that's all you see, and that's all you know.
Well, but the problem is the only way that's going to be the thing that your kid doesn't know is for you not to do it. At some point, personal agency has to come in. What you should be saying is, look at how your grandfather was born behind the 8 ball, and look how hard he had to work in order to get ahead. And look at all the opportunities.
That's true, though. But if your
the problem is I don't see an alternative solution.
Let's take a closer look at Ben's language here. When Ben makes his first two comments about people making better choices and making good decisions, remember, he says that because he views responsibility as something that is built into humans, not necessarily learned, but inherent, given to us by God. So to Ben, it's entirely on the shoulders of the individual to make good decisions, regardless of any other factors. That's why Ben says the only way is for the kid to not pick up a gun and shoot someone. The only way. Ben doesn't think about environmental factors or influence because it requires acknowledgement that human actions are influenced by conditions of exposure. And Ben can't acknowledge that because it decimates his religious view that the kid picking up the gun in his hypothetical scenario is simply making a bad decision with the tools that God gave him. That's why Ben won't budge in this discussion with Rogan, because his religious feelings, his bias, won't let him see beyond the individual. This is also why Ben struggles to exercise empathy to understand someone who grew up differently than he did and whose environment is vastly different than his. Ben is also having trouble utilizing levels of critical thinking that might lead him to understand that an individual must enhance decision-making skills from experience and by learning from other humans, and that even if they do, those decisions are still subject to influence by factors in their surrounding environment. Ben's religious bias is inhibiting his ability to think critically and to empathize. So much so that he's not actually understanding the counterpoints that Rogan brings up, and that's why Ben goes right back to personal agency. But when Rogan keeps pushing back, Ben starts grasping and tries to use a terrible argument of look at your grandfather for inspiration, which is just as shallow a solution as make better decisions. And then finally, we see Ben admit to us all that he's been pushed to his intellectual ceiling and can't go any further because Ben just throws in the towel and says, I don't see an alternative solution. Why doesn't Ben see any other solution? Because Ben is stuck. He's unable to move past that religious bias that we identified earlier. Even though religion isn't present in the words Ben is using in this discussion with Rogan, it is present in the viewpoint Ben expresses, and exists as a bias that shields Ben from meaningful understanding of or contribution to the discussion. And it's a shame, really, that this is Ben's ceiling, because what's he going to do? If Ben truly engages in critical thinking, he risks acknowledging his bias, and that risks exposing his religious world as a lie. And this is a world that has profound meaning to Ben, because his religion has deep ties to his family, his wife, who he will never hesitate to tell you is a doctor, his children, and his opinions on how people should act. Ben built and sees his life through this lens of religion. And if you take that lens away, well, Ben can't risk all of that. And I don't imagine that many people who are in it as deep as Ben is would risk it either, even if they could. So, how does a young Ben Shapiro become religiously indoctrinated and grow up to get stuck in a box like this? We probably won't know for sure, but Ben's father might give us some insight.
Yeah, I used to say to all you guys growing up, there's two phrases that religious Jews use. They'll say something's a Kiddush Hashem, something's a Chilul Hashem. And Kiddush Hashem is something that sanctifies God's name. A Chilul Hashem is something that desecrates God's name. And I said, remember, every action you take, and you're not always going to not always do it right, but every action you take is one of those two things. Either sanctifying God's name or you're desecrating God's name. So be conscious of what you're doing when you're out there.
So that gives us a pretty good idea of why Ben gets so stuck. He was told, as a child, that every action he took is one of two things. He's either sanctifying God's name or desecrating God's name. That's pretty simple. Why would Ben exercise critical thinking to analyze complex factors that contribute to a person's outcomes, or empathy to understand someone else's experience, when his religion makes it so simple? Every action is about making decisions that either sanctify or desecrate God's name. So just make good decisions. Right, Ben? This is how you get stuck in a box and project your biases onto other people. And this is a major reason why I wouldn't recommend listening to Ben when it comes to politics that affect how other people live, because he's just not intellectually up to it. His religious bias hurts him as a thinker, and it inhibits his ability to critically think about and empathize with people who aren't like him.